There's a cluster of videos circulating right now, at least half a dozen of them, all making some version of the same claim, that Grok, the AI chatbot built by Elon Musk's company XAI, was fed the entire book of Revelation along with thousands of pages of historical data, and produced a timeline so alarming it terrified analysts, or believers, depending on which version of the video you land on. One widely repeated version gets remarkably specific, claiming the AI detected over 200 statistical correlations between prophetic descriptions and historical events, with less than 0.1% probability of occurring by chance, and projected a final tribulation period beginning between 2025 and 2030, with culminating events between 2032 and 2037. I want to be very direct with you about this, because the subject matter here deserves real care rather than just entertainment. This claim is fabricated. There is no verifiable research team, no named institution, no published methodology, and no actual traceable Grok conversation behind any of these specific numbers. Nobody has shown their work. And I think it's worth taking a real, honest, and respectful look at why this specific kind of claim, invented statistics wrapped around specific end times dates, is worth being especially careful about. Not because the underlying subject, how Christians have understood and studied the book of Revelation across 2,000 years, isn't a genuinely fascinating and serious topic. It absolutely is. But because giving a fabricated date range for the tribulation, the appearance of AI-verified scientific precision, is exactly the kind of thing that can cause real fear and real harm to people who take their faith seriously, and that deserves to be addressed honestly rather than just repeated for views. So let's do two things properly. First, let's talk honestly about why the specific claim doesn't hold up, on its own technical terms. And then, because the underlying subject really is worth understanding, let's walk through what serious biblical scholars, across a range of Christian traditions, actually say about how Revelation has been read and interpreted, because that real, substantive picture turns out to be considerably richer and considerably more respectful of the text and the people who study it than any invented AI prophecy timeline could ever be. Let's start with the specific claim itself, because picking it apart carefully is useful, and not just for this one video. The claim states that Grok identified over 200 statistical correlations between prophetic descriptions and historical events with less than 0.1% probability of occurring by chance. That sentence is built to sound rigorous, scientific, almost peer-reviewed. But notice what's actually missing from it. Which 200 correlations, specifically? Correlated using what data set? What statistical test was used to calculate that probability figure? Who ran the analysis, and where was it published or reviewed by anyone else? None of that information exists anywhere outside these recycled videos, and that absence is the whole story. Real statistical claims, the kind that appear in actual peer-reviewed research, always come with a methodology section, because the entire point of citing a specific probability figure is to let other researchers check your work. A number like less than 0. 1% probability that appears with no data, no method, and no source isn't a scientific finding. It's a number chosen because it sounds impressively precise, attached to a chatbot's name because that lends it a veneer of technological authority it hasn't actually earned. It's also worth understanding, directly and plainly, why an AI chatbot like Grok is fundamentally not capable of producing the kind of result this claim describes in the first place, regardless of how it's prompted. Large language models generate text by predicting likely word patterns based on the enormous amount of human writing they were trained on. They don't have any independent mechanism for running genuine statistical hypothesis tests against real historical datasets unless a human explicitly sets up and executes that analysis using separate, dedicated statistical tools. And even then, the model itself doesn't have some hidden, privileged insight into the future, or into which historical events genuinely, meaningfully correlate with 2,000-year-old apocalyptic imagery in any statistically rigorous sense. If you actually sat down and asked Grok to analyze the book of Revelation, what you would get is a fluent, well-organized synthesis of existing human scholarship and interpretation on the topic, drawing on the same body of theological, historical, and literary commentary that any well-read seminary student or biblical scholar could access. Not a freshly calculated, statistically verified prophecy timeline pulled from some capability the model doesn't actually possess. There's a particular pattern worth naming here too, because it matters for understanding why this specific genre of content, AI-generated end times predictions, keeps recurring, setting specific dates for biblical prophecy fulfillment, the return of Christ, the beginning of the tribulation, has an extremely long and extremely consistent track record throughout Christian history. And that track record is worth understanding honestly and respectfully, because it comes from a place of real faith and real hope, not foolishness. In the 2nd century, the Montanist movement believed the New Jerusalem was about to descend in their own lifetimes. Setting dates continued through the Middle Ages, through the Reformation, and into the modern era, with the Millerite movement in the 1840s, leading tens of thousands of sincere, devout believers to conclude, based on careful biblical calculation, that Christ would return in 1844, a moment now remembered in religious history as the Great Disappointment, precisely because the date came and went without the expected event. William Miller himself, the movement's founder, responded to that disappointment not with cynicism, but with continued faith, writing that, although he had been mistaken about the timing, he remained confident in the underlying hope itself. That response, and that entire history, reflects something important. Sincere, careful, faithful people have tried to calculate specific end times dates many times before, and every single specific date that's ever been publicly set has passed without the predicted event occurring. A pattern serious theologians across denominations point to directly when cautioning against this kind of date setting, not to mock the impulse behind it, but because Jesus himself, according to the Gospel of Matthew, stated plainly that concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels, and the emphasis in most serious mainstream Christian theology has consistently been on readiness and faithful living, rather than on calculating a specific calendar date. That history matters enormously for evaluating a claim like the one in this video, because attaching a fabricated statistical veneer and an AI chatbot's name to a specific new date range, 2025 to 2030, 2032 to 2037, doesn't actually escape any of the well-documented problems that have caused every previous specific date-setting prediction to fail. It simply dresses that same pattern up in the language of modern technology, hoping that an AI calculated it will feel more credible than a 19th century preacher calculated it, when the underlying epistemic problem, no verifiable data, no sound methodology, no way to actually test or confirm the claim, remains exactly the same. Now, having addressed the fabricated claim honestly, let's turn to what's actually fascinating and worth your genuine attention. How serious, credentialed biblical scholars across a wide range of Christian traditions have actually approached and interpreted the book of Revelation, because this real scholarly landscape is rich, decades in the making, and considerably more interesting than a single invented AI timeline. Revelation, written by a figure identifying himself as John, most likely while exiled on the island of Patmos in the eastern Mediterranean, is generally dated by most biblical scholars to somewhere around the year 95, near the end of the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, a period of real documented pressure and periodic persecution facing early Christian communities across the Roman Empire. Understanding that historical context matters enormously for how serious scholars approach the text, because Revelation belongs to a specific, well-studied ancient literary genre called apocalyptic literature, a category of Jewish and early Christian writing that uses vivid, symbolic, often deliberately coded imagery, beasts, numbers, cosmic battles, to communicate messages of hope and ultimate divine victory to communities living under real, immediate political oppression, drawing heavily on imagery and structure already established in earlier apocalyptic texts like the Book of Daniel. Because of that genre and that historical context, serious biblical scholarship over the centuries has generally organized its approach to Revelation into several broad interpretive traditions, each with real careful scholarly reasoning behind it, and each worth understanding on its own terms rather than dismissing any of them outright. The preterist approach holds that most or all of Revelation's prophecies were fulfilled in the relatively near future relative to when John was actually writing, understanding the text primarily as addressing the real, immediate struggles of first-century Christian communities under Roman persecution, with the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 often treated as a key fulfilled event under this framework. The historicist approach, which was particularly influential among Protestant reformers, interprets Revelation as symbolically depicting the entire sweep of church history, from John's own time all the way through to the end of the age, with various historical figures and events across many centuries, understood as fulfilling specific prophetic symbols along the way. The futurist approach, probably the most familiar to a broad modern audience, particularly within American evangelical Christianity, holds that the majority of Revelation, especially from chapter 4 onward, describes events still to occur, generally including a future 7-year tribulation period, the rise of a figure often called the Antichrist, and Christ's ultimate return, a framework substantially developed and popularized in its modern form by the 19th century theologian John Nelson Darby, and further popularized through the wildly influential Scofield Reference Bible, and, much later, through popular fiction like the Left Behind series. And the idealist approach treats Revelation's imagery as primarily symbolic and timeless, representing the ongoing, recurring spiritual struggle between good and evil throughout all of church history, rather than pointing to any single specific historical period, past or future at all. It's worth being honest and clear that these four broad traditions aren't simply competing guesses thrown out with no basis. Each is grounded in careful, sustained scholarly engagement with the original Greek text, with the historical context of first century Rome and Jewish apocalyptic literary tradition, and with centuries of accumulated theological reflection within different church traditions. Serious, faithful, well-trained biblical scholars and devout believers genuinely disagree with each other across these traditions, and that ongoing, respectful scholarly conversation, conducted through seminaries, academic journals, and church tradition over centuries, is a completely different kind of activity than a fabricated, unsourced claim about an AI chatbot calculating a specific tribulation date range using invented statistics. There's also something genuinely worth appreciating about why Revelation continues to generate this much sustained interest and careful study 2,000 years after it was written, something that a fabricated shock value video actually undersells rather than captures. The text wrestles directly with some of the most enduring human questions there are: the nature and reality of evil in the world, the meaning and possibility of hope in the face of real, sustained suffering and persecution, and the ultimate assurance, central to Christian faith across essentially every one of these interpretive traditions, regardless of their disagreements about the specific timeline, that history is not random or purposeless, but is moving toward a meaningful, divinely ordained conclusion. That's a genuinely profound, serious, and comforting message for many believers, entirely independent of whether you read the text as primarily about first century Rome, the whole sweep of church history, a still future 7-year tribulation, or an ongoing spiritual struggle. Reducing all of that rich, centuries-deep theological tradition down to a fabricated, fear-inducing countdown timer with invented statistical backing doesn't just get the facts wrong, it actually does a disservice to the real depth and pastoral seriousness with which this text has been studied and taught by generations of genuinely careful scholars and faithful teachers. It's also worth addressing directly why content like this specific fabricated video tends to spread so effectively, because understanding the mechanism is useful, protection against it, and against similar content that will inevitably keep appearing on other topics. Claims that touch on genuine, deeply held religious belief carry an emotional weight that a story about, say, a quantum computing benchmark simply doesn't, because for many people, questions about the end times aren't abstract curiosities. They connect directly to real faith, real hope, and sometimes real anxiety. A video that wraps an invented, specific timeline in the borrowed credibility of both a well-known AI company and the appearance of statistical rigor is specifically engineered to exploit that emotional weight, generating clicks and shares precisely because it triggers genuine concern in people who take their faith seriously, rather than because it offers anything real, checkable, or theologically substantive. Recognizing that mechanism, an appeal to fear, dressed in the borrowed authority of technology and statistics, without any actual source, data, or theological grounding behind it, is exactly the kind of pattern worth being able to spot. Not just here, but anytime a similarly dramatic, date-specific religious claim shows up attributed to some vague, unnamed AI analysis. So here's the honest, complete answer to what this video is actually claiming. No credible research team fed Grok the Book of Revelation and received a scientifically verified tribulation timeline, because that specific claim has no verifiable source, no named researcher, and no published methodology anywhere outside a cluster of recycled videos repeating the same invented numbers. What is real and genuinely worth your time if this subject interests you is the actual 2,000-year history of careful, serious, faithful scholarship on Revelation, spanning multiple thoughtful interpretive traditions, each grounded in real engagement with the text's original historical context and language, each taken seriously by devoted scholars and believers across many different church traditions, and each pointing, in its own way, toward the same underlying message of hope, meaning an ultimate purpose that has made this text matter so deeply to so many people for 2 millennia, long before anyone thought to attach a chatbot's name to an invented set of dates in an effort to make you afraid enough to click. Let's spend some more time on the actual literary structure of Revelation itself, because understanding it properly, the way careful scholars actually approach the text, gives you a much richer picture than any fabricated timeline could offer. The book is organized around several repeating cycles of judgment, most famously the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls, each cycle building in intensity and each described using richly symbolic, deliberately vivid imagery: beasts rising from the sea, a woman clothed with the sun, a great dragon, numbers heavy with symbolic meaning like 7, 12, and, most famously, 666. Scholars studying the book's structure have long debated exactly how these 3 cycles of seals, trumpets, and bowls relate to each other chronologically, whether they describe a single sequence of escalating events, 3 parallel, recapitulating descriptions of the same underlying events told from different symbolic angles, or some more complex combination of the two. This is worth mentioning specifically because it's a genuine, long-standing, carefully argued scholarly question, one that respected commentators have written entire books wrestling with, using close attention to the Greek text's grammar and structure. It is not, however, remotely the same thing as a chatbot running an undisclosed statistical analysis and declaring with invented precision that the seals, trumpets, and bowls are partially concurrent, a claim that borrows the language of this real scholarly debate, while offering none of the actual textual argument or reasoning that gives the real debate its substance. It's also worth spending real time on the historical context surrounding Revelation's composition, because understanding it is central to how nearly every serious scholarly tradition approaches the text, regardless of which interpretive framework they ultimately favor. The late 1st century, when most scholars date the book's composition, was a period of real, tangible pressure on early Christian communities, scattered across Roman Asia Minor. The seven churches Revelation directly addresses in its opening chapters, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, were real, historically documented communities facing genuine social, economic, and at times violent pressure for refusing to participate in the increasingly prominent imperial cult, the practice of offering worship to the Roman emperor as a divine figure. Revelation's vivid, coded imagery of beasts and empires is widely understood by scholars across preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist traditions alike to draw at least partly on this immediate, lived experience of imperial power and pressure, using symbolic language partly as a way of communicating dangerous, subversive political and theological content in a form that wouldn't immediately expose the text or its readers to direct Roman reprisal, a genuinely clever, historically grounded literary strategy that careful scholarship has spent considerable effort reconstructing and understanding in real historical detail. There's also real, substantive scholarly value in understanding how Revelation draws on and extends earlier biblical apocalyptic tradition, particularly the book of Daniel, written centuries earlier during a different period of intense pressure on the Jewish community, this time under the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV. Daniel's visions of beasts representing successive empires and its use of coded symbolic numbers to communicate a specific period of trial before divine deliverance established a literary and theological template that Revelation's author draws on directly and extensively, adapting and extending that older tradition to speak to his own community's very different but structurally similar first-century circumstances. Recognizing this connection between Daniel and Revelation is one of the most well-established, broadly agreed upon observations across essentially the entire spectrum of serious biblical scholarship, regardless of which specific interpretive tradition a given scholar ultimately favors, and it's exactly the kind of substantive, historically grounded literary connection that gets completely bypassed when a video substitutes real textual and historical scholarship for an invented AI-generated statistical correlation score. It's worth returning one more time to the specific and genuinely important pastoral concern at the heart of why claims like this deserve serious pushback rather than casual amusement. Throughout Christian history, periods of specific, confident date setting for the end times have often coincided with genuine, sometimes severe psychological and social costs for the people who believed them most sincerely. The Millerite movement's great disappointment in 1844 led some followers to abandon their homes, their farms, and their livelihoods in anticipation of a specific predicted date, only to face the profound emotional and practical difficulty of rebuilding their lives and their faith afterward. More recent examples, including several highly publicized specific date predictions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, have produced similar patterns. Sincere believers making significant, sometimes drastic life decisions based on a confidently predicted date, followed by real grief, confusion, and, in some documented cases, lasting damage to their trust in religious teaching more broadly when the predicted date passed without incident. Serious pastors, theologians, and biblical scholars across a wide range of denominations have consistently pointed to this exact historical pattern as the core reason for caution around specific date setting, not out of any doubt about the sincerity of the believers involved, but precisely because of how much real, documented harm this specific pattern has caused, again and again, to people who took the predictions seriously and organized real parts of their lives around them. This is exactly why presenting a fabricated, statistically dressed-up prophecy timeline as though it came from a credible, verified AI analysis isn't a harmless piece of viral entertainment. It's a modern iteration of a pattern with real, documented, sometimes serious consequences for real people, wrapped in language specifically designed to feel more credible and more urgent than previous date-setting claims because it borrows the reputation of a well-known technology company and the appearance of statistical rigor, neither of which the claim actually possesses. Recognizing that pattern and being able to explain clearly why it doesn't hold up isn't about dismissing anyone's faith or mocking the genuine seriousness with which believers approach questions about the end times. It's about protecting people from exactly the kind of manufactured, fear-inducing content that has, throughout history, caused real harm when it's been mistaken for something more credible than it actually is. If you're someone who genuinely finds the book of Revelation and questions about biblical prophecy more broadly a meaningful and important area of study, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, the far more rewarding path forward is engaging with the real, substantial body of serious biblical scholarship that exists on this topic. Commentaries and academic works from respected theologians across the preterist, historicist, futurist, and idealist traditions. Careful historical studies of first century Roman Asia Minor and the specific church's Revelation addresses, and thoughtful comparative work connecting Revelation back to Daniel and the broader Jewish apocalyptic literary tradition that shaped it. That real body of scholarship offers something a fabricated AI timeline never could. Centuries of careful, faithful, intellectually honest engagement with a text that has mattered enormously to millions of people, conducted by scholars willing to show their reasoning, cite their sources, and openly acknowledge where genuine, respectful disagreement remains, rather than a single unsourced number dressed up to look more certain and more urgent than any honest treatment of this deeply meaningful subject could ever actually be. And that, in the end, is really the most honest place to leave this. The book of Revelation has survived 2,000 years of careful reading, hard historical questions, genuine theological disagreement, and yes, plenty of failed date setting along the way, precisely because the questions it raises about suffering, about hope, about whether history is heading somewhere meaningful, are real questions that don't need an invented statistic or a chatbot's name attached to matter. If this is a subject you care about, it deserves better than a recycled video promising a countdown clock. It deserves the same thing it's always rewarded: patient, honest, well-sourced attention from people willing to show you exactly how they got their answer. It's worth adding one final practical thought because it's genuinely useful well beyond this specific video. If you or someone you know encounters a similar claim in the future, an AI or any other source, offering a specific date or timeline for prophetic events, there are a few honest questions worth asking before taking it seriously. Who, specifically, conducted this analysis? And can you find their name attached to any credible, checkable publication? What actual data or methodology was used, and has anyone else been able to review or reproduce it? And does the claim account for the long, well-documented history of previous specific date predictions, and explain clearly why this particular claim would be different from all the ones that came before it and didn't come to pass? If those questions can't be answered, and in the case of this specific viral claim, they can't be, that's not a reason to dismiss anyone's faith or their genuine interest in what Revelation teaches. It's simply a reason to look elsewhere for a trustworthy answer, toward the real, patient, centuries-deep scholarly tradition that has always been willing to show its work, rather than toward a video that asks you to trust a number nobody can actually source.